So anti-Semitism in and of itself isn't the answer. There is careerism, opportunism, and many different motivating factors, not simply anti-Semitism. Use of coercion and terror is what most people think. The Nazi state came in with their secret police, imposed the will of Hitler on the people. Well, if used, it was used very rarely and almost as a last solution. Hitler wanted to look like a leader who believed in law and order. The people did not have to be coerced. You cannot overlook, though, Hitler as a central decisive figure. Without him, most of this probably wouldn't have happened. It's often, there's this debate between intentionalism and functionalism, which is sort of an old debate now. Was it Hitler dictating what was going on, or the society of Germans who are simply naturally anti-Semitic and want to kill people? Well, what you had simply was, you had anti-Semitism as sort of the overriding norm of society. But then you had this political structure of Hitler. He was, if you would, a feudal lord over his kingdom, sort of mirroring the Holy Roman Empire idea in Germany, where you had the emperor and then you had all these lords who really had the power below him. Hitler never arrested one of those lords. They were called Gauleiters, who controlled different districts throughout Germany. He never touched them, never dared to. He would assassinate SA leaders, political opponents, sure, but never one of these lords who were underneath him. How did he get around that, though? The SS. The SS allowed him to do things that the old Holy Emperor could never do. He could have a private army to enforce his will, and everybody else began to work toward the Führer, knowing that was the way you had to go. So the SS became pivotal in Hitler exerting his power and will over the German political landscape. Nazi ideology, here's that book, The Poisonous Mushroom. It's bizarre, isn't it? You have this picture that, to me, I'm an Irish Catholic, right? I mean, I see a leprechaun here under the mushroom, right? Imagery is tough. And what you notice, I think, early on, of those Stars of David put on these grotesque imagery of what Jews are. For let's face it, no Jew looks like this. You saw the images. They look like us. They are us. They are us. We're human beings together. There's no racial difference other than ethnicity, right? We all have blood. We all have the same biology. The Stars of David are there, I think, because people have to be reminded that these are Jews. If they don't get the imagery, they can get the Star of David, to remember that. And if you go through this book, you'll see the ideology. But to break it down, race, not a biological concept. And in fact, most Germans, in fact, the top scientists knew that race was a wrong idea, which I think is very interesting. They knew the philosophy was wrong. The top intellectual scholars of Germany knew it was wrong. Regardless of that, they backed Hitler's ideology. Why? Were they anti-Semitic? Most likely not, because they already said that race was wrong. It's not a valid biological science. So what was motivating these people? And here they are measuring people's, they look at their head sizes, they look at their eye color to define what race they are. Why do you need this sort of pseudo-scientific method of measuring people to find out what race they are? Because when Hitler first said we're going to attack Jews because of their race, they drew blood samples. And what they found out was, guess what? The blood was human. It was like everybody else's. And so legally you had a huge problem. How do you make lawyers, judges, and others convict people of crimes of being a different race if you can't have the biological evidence to back it up? So they went to how you looked. So they began to classify people by how you looked. Gypsies had a certain head size, right? Jews had a certain look, and on it went. Well, that is not a very scientific or efficient way of doing things. In fact, if there's anything funny about this, there really isn't, but this one kind of makes me laugh, was this award-winning entry to the most Aryan baby contest for the most popular German magazine. A Jewish kid. The most Aryan baby of 1935, I think it was a Jewish kid. Now, it's kind of funny, except if you're the mother of that Jewish child. Because the story was that the photographer who took their family photos, at those great moments we all have, said, this is ridiculous. Hitler's a fool. I'm going to throw one over on him. Entered the pictures to a contest, and lo and behold, they won. He laughed, had a great chuckle. The mother the next day looked at the image and almost had a stroke. What is my child doing on the front of this magazine? Well, Hitler's a fool. See, everybody will see this. It's a Jewish kid. We're all Germans together. Eugenics. Really, the intellectuals, the key for Hitler, I think, is when the intellectuals back him. No person with a bizarre ideology can do anything in a society unless the intellectual community backs him. And that's what happened in Germany. Eugenics became sort of their mantra. Human race can be improved by controlled breeding. Sterilization came in early on To eliminate illnesses and handicaps, and movies were made, beautiful movies, about how you can make the race better. There's a movie about a young German woman who had contracted tuberculosis, who was going to voluntarily submit herself to gas to preserve the race. And very sentimental at the end, the husband says goodbye, but thank you for your sacrifice for the German people. And the music played, and there it was. But as we shake our heads, I see you're doing this. You must know that before Hitler, the United States led the world in forced sterilizations. In fact, Vermont was one of the leaders of forced sterilizations of Canadian loggers who came across the border, fearing that Vermonters would become Canadian loggers. 30,000 forced sterilizations from 1907 to 1939. When I talked to Sybil Niemöller, Martin Niemöller's widow, she said, Tom, why should we have resisted Hitler in the 1930s? Why? Winston Churchill was praising him as a great leader. The army was getting its honor back. We were restoring law and order. So we had some forced sterilizations. So did you. So we had some segregation of Jews. So did you. Did you resist your government in the 1930s? Why should we have resisted ours? Paul Vincent, yesterday at the anniversary, he's my boss, made a wonderful statement. He was talking about letters he receives from his students. And the students always, from their moral position, say, how come America didn't do more to stop the Holocaust? Where were we? What did we do? Well, the answer is a difficult one. First of all, the gas chambers were in operation in December 8th of 1941. Pearl Harbor was December 7th. We weren't even in the war yet. And before the gas chambers, more Jews were shot by the German army that previous summer than would be killed in all the gas chambers combined for the rest of the war. Right? So by the time we're into the war, it's a difficult situation. But he said, why are we asking that question? Why aren't we asking, why did our government intern Japanese people in concentration camps? And his statement was, their persecution is always wrong, ours is always justifiable. It was the war, right? We had to intern them. Well, the point is that any human rights violations is wrong, regardless of justification. I can guarantee that Germans felt the same way in 1935 in Germany, that their hatred was somehow justified. These are, of course, going out, these are doctors and nurses going out and creating the data bank for racial characteristics out in the field. And these are gypsy ones being done. The nurse on the right was very famous for rounding up children, measuring them, and then sending them to the gas chamber after results were done. So in classrooms, you would have, obviously, this is from that same book, The Poisonous Mushroom. These were lesson plans that we received after the war. There's a whole study being done now on what schools did, what curriculums were like in the war. And it's a very difficult question also because as you look at these imagery, remember, German cities were bombed throughout the war. And the German population was therefore on the move. People would leave their school districts, go to the countryside for safety. There was sort of this constant movement. How much curriculum influenced their thinking is really a debatable point, for they kept moving from school district to school district. But anyway, when you see these kind of books, the lessons were, tonight for homework, draw a Jew. What is that? I'm sorry. And they give the stereotype. As a student, you have a decision to make. Do you want to get an A, or do you want to be right? So it's not a big choice for a teenage kid. I'll draw what he wants. When it entered the classroom, and again, this is an actual picture of two students being brought to the front of the class. On the back, you see the lesson about what Jews are, and their classmates are identifying their racial characteristics in front of the class. This is just before they're expelled from schools anyway across Germany. So let's look at the laws and early stages of persecution. Hitler comes to power. Within 3 weeks, the first anti-Jewish attack begins. Again, it's complicated. This does not come from Hitler's office. He was very savvy not to issue the orders publicly, but it went from behind the scenes. Again, he wants to be a legitimate political leader who believes in law and order. But the word went out, we need to boycott Jewish stores. So the SA, with glee in their hearts, went out on April 1st, April Fool's Day, to boycott Jewish stores. Don't buy from Jewish shops. They all stood there and did it. Across Germany, though, most Germans came to these signs, were shocked by them, read them, chuckled, and in most cases, went shopping. They had gone there their whole lives. There were certain stores they liked. There were certain products they liked. They kept shopping. That night, Hitler canceled the boycott. What's striking me, though, is a letter Hitler receives at that same time during Easter from an Armin T. Wegener. He writes Hitler personally after seeing these boycotts and things take place and the essay Violence on the Streets, and he says, "In the name of the people for whom I have the right and no less the duty to speak, as a German," remember Goldhagen, right? All Germans are inherently evil. "As a German who was not given the gift of speech in order to become a silent accomplice, put a stop to all of this." For a man to write that letter in 1933 is a miracle. Remember, Sybil Niemöller said, "How are we supposed to resist? How are we supposed to know where this is going?" This fellow did. He wrote personally to Hitler, which tells you he thought Hitler was not going to become the Hitler we all think he was going to become. Here was a fellow World War I veteran. Armin T. Wegener was a World War I German soldier who would understand that law and order and our own citizens' safety is at risk. Hitler was so savvy that in most of these instances, up until 1938, most local Germans would say, if only Hitler knew what the SA were doing in our town, he'd put a stop to it. They all saw in him what they wanted to see. They had to. Why is Wegener important? Why is he one of my heroes? Armin T. Wegener, if you look at any photographs of the 1915 Armenian genocide, the photographer was a German lieutenant named Armin T. Wegener, helping out as a medic these people suffering from the Turkish genocide. Did he know where Germany was going 3 weeks into Hitler's power? Absolutely. He was giving us warnings. That's us today, isn't it? We know the antecedents to all this kind of thing. We can listen to them or not, or we know what's coming and try to do something about it. Hitler took a different conclusion from the Armenian genocide. They did it and got away with it. So can we. Wegener, another German, has a different conclusion. The Nazis were very tied to law. This seems almost like an oxymoron that the Holocaust was legal. But from the German mindset, Hitler basically never acted unless he passed a law first. Laws are good. Laws keep order, right? We follow the law. We're law-abiding citizens. So he was very attuned to passing over 2,000 laws throughout his entire regime against Jews. That's an obsession, 2,000 laws just against Jews at a time where many Jews didn't even exist in Germany anymore. It is the leaders of a country who determine the policy, and it is always a simple matter to drag the people along, whether it is a democracy or a fascist dictatorship or a parliament or a communist dictatorship. Voice or no voice, the people can always be brought to the bidding of the leaders. That is easy. All you have to do is to tell them that they are being attacked and denounce the peacemakers for lack of patriotism and exposing the country to danger. It works the same in any country. Hermann Goering, chief of the Prussian police, which was the largest police force in Germany, soon to be the #1 law enforcement officer in Germany. This is what he was saying as a chief law enforcement officer. Instantly, Hitler gave police a lot of power. Why? The German people wanted that. We want law and order back, put police on the street. He did. Who were those police? The SA brown shirts. No police training at all, except we like to beat people up. Terrific. Take on the communists. The new police powers that were given, in the background is Gestapo headquarters in Berlin. Secret trials of anybody the government suspects of being a threat to the national security. Preventative arrest and protective custody. What that basically boiled down to was, we know in the future person X is going to commit a crime against the state. We better arrest them now before they do it in the future. That would be, of course, preventative arrest. You'll see this in most legal documents in 1933 and 34. Or, even more fancy term, legal term, protective custody. We know that in the future you're a threat to our society and people will find out about it. So to protect you, we're going to send you to Dachau, from your fellow citizens. Police can dispense with hearings before a judge, simply arrest people on the street without a hearing. Reduction of legal rights for the accused. Hitler basically said there is no equality before the law. That's a liberal idea. Concentration camps pop up all over the country, especially outside of major cities, on purpose, and they were visible. Reporters were invited to go to them because he was establishing law and order. And if you see people in prison, they must have done something to deserve their fate. Thank goodness I'm not one of them. I'm a law-abiding citizen. And as Hitler said, I must abolish the liberal idea of equality before the law. I'm glad you said that, because it's what I was, in a way, I guess in the back of my mind hoping. As I put this together, and I looked at those first police powers, and I looked at the Patriot Act, they mirror each other. Warnings, okay? And as people say, you're unpatriotic if you criticize in the time of war. Again, I reiterate, isn't that an American right? Isn't that what makes us Americans? But again, it's a time of feeling threatened. It's a time where our law and order is at stake. We must protect ourselves. At what cost becomes, I guess, the issue. When you think concentration camp, you might have images again. I played with imagery already. This is a concentration camp. So when I mentioned there are concentration camps all over Germany, some were in the basements of police headquarters because all the police now were rivaling each other, who can arrest more people kind of thing. And they had their own ad hoc sort of cellar concentration camps. You had more significant ones being built at Dachau outside of Munich, or Sachsenhausen outside Berlin a little bit later on. During the war, this was a French-run one called Drancy for French internees on their way to Auschwitz. It was an apartment building. I put this in sequence I usually put at the end, but I was at a presentation last week, and a student said exactly what you said. And he then said, it was terrific, he was a high school sophomore, and he said, Mr. White, we can't give up our liberties. If we do that, we don't deserve any of our freedoms. I said, you know, that rings a bell. So I went back to Ben Franklin. Those who would give up essential liberty to purchase a little temporary safety, and I think especially in times of threat, Franklin said, deserve neither liberty or safety. Who are the first targets? Now remember, Hitler has as his sort of personal agenda to get rid of Jews. He wanted them to disappear. That was the language he used. What that means, we don't know. We want homeless people to disappear so we feel better about things, right? Did it mean he wanted to gas them in 1933? Most likely not. It wasn't even an opportunity for him. Who are his first targets when you're establishing law and order in your country? Who is it okay to arrest? Beggars on the street, homeless people. Communists, of course, because of the perceived threat at the time. You know, who are our people that we would arrest right at this stage of the game? Criminals, obviously. Liberals. Asocials, that would include homosexuals. Jehovah's Witnesses, because they would not take a loyalty oath to Hitler. In fact, in this country, Jehovah's Witnesses will not say the Pledge of Allegiance. I'm worried about them. Gypsies and the handicapped. What's missing? Jews. April 1st, 1933, German people aren't ready yet. But they're ready for this. These are more acceptable arrests. There are people in our lives that we're human beings. There are people, and I always tell my students this when I go out, we know the person in the hallway who we don't associate with. We know that person. No one likes that person. And in fact, we feel almost good not associating with that person. And we have our own friends. In fact, we go home to our parents and we say, I don't hang out with so-and-so, and we define ourselves, therefore, as good people. And I would say, are we? Because we're somehow separate from these others in our lives. You just saw the list of others in 1933 Germany that made them morally superior. When it's okay to dislike people a little bit, you start walking down that path that I've already mentioned. Early arrest, preventative arrest, these were basically communist, social democrats in Dachau. If you were Jewish, it was by accident. You weren't being arrested because you were Jewish here, but there were some Jews here also. Prisoner clothing, of course, makes them seem like criminals. Here, under S.A. Guard, opposition to, these are political opponents of Hitler were arrested. And again, Nazis criminalized all criticism against the government. Political opponents or malicious gossip was seen as dangerous in this time of national emergency. Hitler became chancellor. He persuaded the cabinet to declare a state of emergency again. That status, that's what's been going on for 3 years. That's what people do. And basically, I would think the key moment here was the Reichstag fire, where Hitler came out and said this is their parliament house. They've set it on fire. It must be the beginning of a communist revolution. Papers were forged to show that the communists were doing this right. What Hitler didn't know is that he was right. A communist did in fact burn down the Reichstag. He was this psychotic Dutchman who had come to Germany and set the place on fire. They actually caught him carrying the torch. They didn't know who they had. They didn't care. All Hitler said, like he always did, moment of opportunity, that day he said, give me emergency powers to stop the communist revolution. The chief of police, Hermann Goering, forged a document that said, here's the communist revolution about to occur, and most Germans said, please save us. And you see, of course, the posters here, right, under protective custody in Dachau. Jehovah's Witnesses, this woman here was beheaded during the war for not swearing loyalty to Hitler. The children survived. Martin Niemöller. First they came for the communists. But I was not a communist, so I did not speak out. Then they came for the socialists and the trade unionists, but I was neither, so I did not speak out. Then they came for the Jews, but I was not a Jew, so I did not speak out. And then they came for me in 1939, and there was no one left to speak out for me. He's telling us we know the antecedents to prejudice and violence. Violation of human rights. We should be aware of that from the early stages and react earlier. When Sybil told me they went to Dachau after the war, and she said, Martin and I looked at the Dachau sign, and it said X number of million persecuted here, the whole bit, and Martin fell into tears. And Sybil put her arm around him and said, I know. He says, no, you don't understand. I'm not crying about that number. I'm crying about the other number. So what are you talking about? We all knew that millions are going to be persecuted by the Nazis. We knew this was coming. This shouldn't surprise us at all. What I'm crying about are the numbers below. So she looked back, and what did it say? 1933 to 1945. He said, I didn't resist until 1938 and 39. Where was I in 1933? And he fell to pieces saying, this is my fault. So you're Hitler, what stops you from making Jews disappear? Using his terms in 1933, he promised to restore order. He can't arrest people on the street without any kind of precedent. People won't like that. The brown shirts want revolution and take on Jews immediately. They're embarrassing Hitler left and right. Hitler wants to keep his power. Traditional society was very rooted. Decent middle-class people, right, were saying this is craziness. Hitler lost 2 million votes before he was elected chancellor. The economy, of course, is in tatters. You can't simply arrest your infrastructure and hope your economy recovers. The bureaucracy itself, very conservative, would be very low of lawlessness. And of course, you have to get the whole police system and legal system behind you to arrest people. There's a lot of challenges to meet. It took relatively short time to do so. So what are German Jews as a population percentage? Guesses would range in middle school from anywhere from 2% to 10%. I've heard as high as 15% of the German population were Jewish in 1933. High school kids, 20% to 90%, I heard last week, were Jews. And the actual figure is, of course, not even a percentage point. Or if you go to the actual figures here, 505,000 people out of a population of 67 million. It's interesting that the myths are being taught to our kids as they get older. They're not being taught, but they're being assumed, right? Jews control German society. They have X number of percent. It gets higher as you get older. Where does that come from? That's why our mission is so important. We have to counterbalance those natural tendencies to think that way. And so Jews studying the Holocaust is good, but doesn't change anything. They were powerless. How does it work legally? How does it so quickly evolve and develop? Over 2,000 laws are going to be passed against Jews alone in the Third Reich. I've got a list of them over there. Some are things like Jews can't sell flowers on Hitler's birthday, bizarre laws. But anyway, guys would sit there in the office and try to outdo each other, There's a law, let's impress Hitler, let's come up with a new law, and they kept thinking and thinking and thinking. First, you need to legally define who Jews were. I told you that's a problem because Nazi ideology was about race, and race doesn't exist, right, biologically. So how do you do it? They went to religious definitions. Jews in the Nuremberg laws have what I think two Jewish grandparents. That makes you a Jew of the first class. And if you have one German Jewish grandparent, you're a Mischlinge or a half Jew. And they did religious definitions. Does that do what Hitler wants? No. Hitler says that the Jewish race is what I need to get at. The Jewish ideas. And what are Jewish ideas? Jewish ideas are things like equality. Karl Marx was a Jew, though he had actually said, I'm not Jewish, and he was very anti-Semitic in his own right. But anyway, he said Marx was a Jew. He invented communism, so communism is a Jew trick. Jesus was a Jew. Christianity is a Jew trick because it teaches equality. And those who live by the sword die by the sword. So Christian ideology is a danger to the state. Well, these are abstract ideologies. How do you attack them? You do the best you can if you're Hitler. You go with religious definitions first, and you keep enlarging it as your power enlarges also. Deprive people of income. Once you define them, you can now say that Jews, as defined by the Nuremberg laws, can't practice law, can't practice medicine, can't be teachers. And as you take away professions, naturally you take away their income, a basic human right to provide for yourself, which means now you're going to lose your property. If you read the stories of these laws, you read the laws off, but if you read individual people who wake up and find out the next morning that they're no longer a legal child because their mother is Jewish and their father is Aryan, and their father was a lawyer, and their mother now, right, do I go with my mother or father? I guess my father, I guess, because he's the Aryan, but legally I'm not even born because my mother was Jewish, and therefore the marriage is null and void. These instant dilemmas take place. And when you lose your income, you lose your property, and by natural tendency you find yourself in the poor parts of town, and the first ghettos begin to be created. And then you have restrictions of movement. Once they're there, you keep them there, you pass laws, and then the final step, branding, you wear those stars, the ultimate humiliation. So again, we go back to these Nuremberg pictures, and again, these were German citizens who, because of Hitler, were going to be defined as threats to the nation. The Nuremberg laws were passed. If you sleep with a Jew, you've therefore defiled the race, made it impure. Here's signs. These people are standing in front of the brown shirts, not the brown shirted thugs, right? And it's saying things like, I slept with a Jew and I'm a race defiler. Except for the fact, and here's an interesting story, of all minorities in Germany in the First World War, the largest percentage of World War I veterans were Jews. They were loyal Germans, right? They're Germans. The German army, though, in 1916, facing popular anti-Semitism at home, did a survey about what was the percentage of actual German Jews serving in the front lines. So as early as the First World War, this mentality was coming out that Jews somehow aren't loyal to the nation. What they found out was Jews were the highest percentage of those serving in the armed forces of a minority. They buried it. They didn't publish it at all. Again, walking through the streets, don't buy from Jewish shops, so on and so forth. Jews not wanted here, signs going up everywhere. But remember, most of these towns in Germany have no Jews in them. Where are these signs coming from? You're trying to get to the will of the Fuhrer. You're trying to basically, get yourself attuned to what the nation is thinking and doing. And it isn't much different than what was going on in this country at the same time. Only for Aryans, and you see the humiliation here. And who's taking these photos, right? So you have these humiliated looks. And what makes it all bizarre, I think, if there's, again, anything funny about this, here's a bench for Aryans only. A dog can sit there. A dog was above the order of a Jew. But does it look familiar? As I go through some of these imagery of these people, we get to sort of the critical year, which is 1938. In 1938, Hitler has had 5 years to assume power. He has now assumed power. The police are behind him. The unions now he's destroyed. He has power. He's going to use it. He's ready. He declares war in November of 1938 on Jews. It's called Kristallnacht. Before that, he'd invaded Austria. Remember, Hitler was Austrian. He wasn't German. He invades his home country, makes it part of the Reich. The Austrians to this day will say, we were the first victims of Hitler. We were the first country he invaded. Problem with that, of course, is that most Austrians, welcomed Hitler with open arms. As percentage points, Austrian Nazis ranked up at the top. The Sound of Music and that whole thing, the Von Trapp family and as they fight the Nazis is a wonderful story of that family. It certainly wasn't symbolic of Austrians at that time. When you see these images of Vienna, you have instantly, this is the day the Germans march in, Jews are made to clean the sidewalks with toothbrushes. It's a public spectacle and people are having a lot of fun. There was a statue in Vienna, very similar to this, where people were down, doing the sidewalks with the toothbrush as the people stood around them, and it was removed by the Viennese city council, saying when Americans come to Vienna, they look at the statue and they get their picture taken with it. They don't know what it was all about. So not to disgrace the memory of what really happened, we're going to take that down. So there are no memorials to what happened in Vienna in 1938. Kristallnacht takes place November of 38. And as you look at these images, they're kind of striking, right? You've got these people watching the synagogues burn down while they're hosing down the buildings next door, but not the synagogue. They had orders from the police and fire department to basically save the property because Germans would think it was awful if property was lost in this pogrom. But this picture always strikes me as interesting. Based on what I told you about historical anti-Jewish feeling and anti-Semitism, here's a destroyed synagogue in Aachen. In the background, look at the church spires of Christendom. It was very acceptable in Christendom to do this. The SS now enter. After 38, here's what basically happens. Hitler has made his first declared pogrom from the platform as a political leader. From 33 to 38, he was very savvy, didn't officially do it, except for the Nuremberg laws, which most people thought, that's good, he's not going to go any further. Great, we now know what to expect. In 1938, when he says, we are going to attack German, Jewish synagogues and shops and everything else, he does it as a political leader. The people rally around him and do it. The SS were very upset with what happened. The SS were very into law and order and all that kind of stuff and said, this may be a mistake. In fact, that very next day, most German public opinion polls, those Gestapo public opinion polls, said that the German people were against Kristallnacht because so much property was destroyed. Therefore, the name, the Night of Broken Glass. These are plate glass windows that were very expensive, and German insurance companies had to pay for them. Many Germans were very upset by that. The SS stepped in and said, enough's enough, we're taking over. We're going to make this legal, we're going to make it much more efficient, and in fact, we're going to blame the Jews for causing all the violence in the first place, and therefore they have to pay for all the damage. That covers our angles, and in fact, you should know that Kristallnacht actually happens. One reason why was that Joseph Goebbels, the club-footed short fellow who was not racially pure in Nazi ideology, but was the minister of propaganda, had fallen out with Hitler because he had an extramarital affair. He turned to Hitler and said, Hitler, I have a good idea. Try to get back into his good graces. Let's attack the synagogues. Good idea, says Hitler. It's about time. and he gets back into the good graces. Hitler thought that an extramarital affair was immoral, but destroying synagogues and killing people was moral. The SS immediately arrests people by the tens of thousands that next day, blaming them for the destruction and law and order problems that Germany was facing, and marched them publicly to the streets of the concentration camps they had been building the last 3 years. Why? Money. If you can get people into concentration camps, you now have free slave labor, and the SS were all about making money. Meanwhile, the T4 program. This is a hospital in Germany called Hadamar. You'll see the black smoke coming out of the smokestack from the crematoria, which is next to the gas chamber in the basement of this German hospital. This is before the Holocaust. T4 was an address in Berlin where people got together and said, we need to kill the handicapped people. How to do it. In October of '39, Hitler authorized formally the program to kill handicapped people to save the race. Health courts are set up. Government utilized the public health system to do this. Basically, it was done as a guise of preserving public health. It was a public health initiative. And by the end of 1941, 70,000 undesirables had been gassed in these hospitals. Now, I tell this story because here is how they did it through basically buses, and 5,000 children were killed in these things. You'll notice to 1945. Here's the story of T4 that I think is significant. The German people found out about it. These weren't Jews being killed. These were, again, Aryans. As they found out about it, and more kids had the same death certificate, even though they just talked to them the day before, questions were asked. In fact, a local Gestapo report from Hadamar said, the people think something is rotten here. They get very nervous. Public demonstrations all over the country stopped the program. It was stopped. This was 1939. When the program ends officially in 1941, Hitler officially does cancel it, something happens that most people aren't aware of. The hospitals that had been set up to run this death machine in these hospitals, that was standard operating procedure. Regardless of the national order to quit, they still did it. In fact, by the end of the war, when German soldiers who were terribly wounded at the front were being sent back home for the best medical care, they were being sent to these hospitals. And because they're no longer racially fit, were being gassed in their own gas chambers of their own people. What starts with the Jews, right, or with anybody who's oppressed, comes back to haunt us. It's in our own self-interest not to do these kind of things. A German soldier came to one of these hospitals, an American soldier, 3 weeks after the war was over, found them gassing people in the basement 3 weeks after the war had ended. What are you doing? Well, that's what we do here. You know, I got to kill X number of people. It was a bureaucratic machine. That's simply what they did. Again, this perpetrator idea, do you think of the leaders or the street thugs, or do you think of the nurses of Hadamar, who before the Holocaust were killing people in the gas chambers for the race? You should know that when T4 was officially closed down, you had a lot of doctors with a lot of experience. They needed a job. Any guesses where they're about to be hired? They have their portfolios and their recommendations about we know how to build gas chambers and kill people. They're about to be hired at Auschwitz, Treblinka, Sobibor, Chelmno, and Majdanek. Towards a final solution, this is again, when the war begins, by this time, you know, Hitler has now got his Hitler Youth trained about race and this kind of stuff, and they begin the war really with this kind of a slogan: we're off to Poland to fight the Jews. You cannot separate Hitler's Nazi ideology from the war. It's why the war was fought. He needs living space, he thinks, for his own people, and he needs to stop the Jewish conspiracy that's destroying his country and diluting their race. And as the war goes on, the goals begin to change. At first, it was to occupy territory so we could resettle our people. Major demographic changes in Europe. But as they came upon more and more Jewish people the further east they went, by 1939, 1/3 of German Jews had tried to flee the country. They were gone. So the percentage was even smaller. So they were dealing with it fairly well. When they assumed Austria, they came upon more Jews, but a guy by the name of Adolf Eichmann said, I have a way to deal with them. Let's force them to leave through deportation. When they get parts of Czechoslovakia, then Poland, they come upon millions and millions of more Jews. And the policies of deportation and that kind of stuff doesn't work. There are too many Jews, and they see them as a direct threat to their own national self-survival. So as the war progressed and they became more successful, they had more problems with who Jews were. The SS was trying to sort of implement their demographic and engineering plans of shifting populations all over Europe. The idea at first was to sort of imprison Jews and take away property of Eastern Europeans, kill their leaders so they won't be a threat to us, mostly male, because it's a male-dominated Nazi hierarchy. They believed that males were the threat, so they would kill the males, right, and then take over their property. Local initiatives, local people in Ukraine, Poland said, hey, let's kill some people. We don't like Jews. After all, they're the religious enemies of Catholicism. And that was happening left and right. Jan Gross just wrote a book about a Polish town that killed all its Jews under German occupation. Germans didn't do it, the Poles did. To this day, the Poles deny it. In fact, a Polish priest in Gdansk 2 years ago put in front of his church a burned out barn where they killed all the Jews in this town with little corpses. This is during Holy Week, with a sign that says, "Don't forget the Jews killed Christ." That was 2 years ago. He was fired. As Hitler gets more and more success on the foreign policy front, he gets more and more emboldened. Every action he takes now is directly after a major foreign policy success. So here are your short-range plans. First of all, they were going to resettle people. That was kind of the first plan. These are kind of detailed here. In fact, when that isn't working, they have so many Jews, the question comes up, why don't we ship them out of Europe to Madagascar? Again, these were average people dealing with a bureaucratic problem. What do you do with Jews who are a threat to us? And Madagascar, an island off of Africa, run by the French. Well, France had just fallen. They thought this might be a possibility. Then they said, no, not Madagascar. The next plan was to settle them in the east, ship them into Siberia, get them away from us. You saw the ghettos there. The idea was to quarantine Jews to keep them away from us because they're sort of this bacillus that's going to destroy our race. But of course, the invasion takes place of the USSR. Is a tremendous success for Hitler. By mid-July, early October, at the height of German victory, they've not been defeated yet. In fact, they're rolling toward Moscow, Stalingrad, and Leningrad. Hitler convenes a meeting between Himmler and Heydrich, his two SS chiefs, and says, can we kill these Jews rather than ship them east? It was Hitler's initiative. And by the end of October, they said, yes, we can, and here's how we're going to do it. The decision had already been made when the Wannsee Conference was called in January of 1942. A meeting that was originally scheduled for December 7th, 1941. But of course, Pearl Harbor happened. And the meeting, of course, took, and by the way, the Japanese and the Germans never coordinated what was going on. Hitler was stunned by Pearl Harbor. After all, the Japanese race, you get into complications here, right? Weren't they a race too? No, Hitler said they're Aryan. It's bizarre stuff. Anyway, with that in mind, the Wannsee Conference is held as a fabulous movie that HBO produced a few years ago called Conspiracy that I would highly recommend. Heydrich, an SS chief, sits everybody down and says, here's what we're going to do. And basically, the gassing has already taken place. December 8th, the day after the conference was supposed to be convened, Helmno begins to gas its first Jewish victims. But the meeting takes place, it's 90 minutes. Sort of sub-level people throughout the bureaucracy come in, and the SS kind of reveal that they're taking over the operation. There's a great chance for people to say no. There was all kinds of bureaucratic rivalry as to who was going to take over Jewish policy. At the end of 90 minutes, the SS basically had taken over, and everybody was going to follow them or they were going to destroy them. So they had their official green light to go ahead. It had already started anyway. The ghettos were sealed in 1940. Little kids like this didn't have a chance. Einsatzgruppen and action squads before the gassings took place are sent in with the German army. 4 major Einsatz, these are special action groups, sort of a German translation of it, to basically shoot Jews, political opponents, commissars, potential enemies, priests, that kind of thing. And in the summer of 1941, as they go east into Poland and to Russia, they killed 2.5 million people just by firing squads. It became very damaging to the psyche of the soldiers. Himmler was very worried about the psyche of his SS men doing this, and by the way, much of the German army that was also doing this, even though to this day they deny it. But you can't kill 2.5 million people with a handful of SS units, right? So because this is, by the way, a beach in Latvia, well, the kids are being brought down to be killed and buried in the beach. Again, the photograph being taken. The bureaucrats get together and they said, we're wasting too many bullets, it's too slow, it's psychologically damaging, what are some options? And the options were produced. Collaborators were willingly able to kill local Jews because if they did, they got their property. These were their neighbors. One fellow I met, Zev Weiss, lived in Poland. He lost 76 members of his family. He was the only survivor. He was on the Auschwitz death march at the end of the war, one of the few to survive that. He was kept alive by an American Quaker captain who every day went to this hospital where he delivered Zev, and he said, take care of this fellow. And they said, we don't take care of Jews. American captain put the pistol in the guy's face, and he said, you're going to take care of him. I'm going to come back every day. They did. Why did he do it? Zev asked, why did you save my life? You know, and he said, it's very simple. My mother was a Quaker. She said, if I ever abandon someone in need, I'm no longer her son. I need to have my mother. I need to save you. This is all over. Months went by. He basically came back. He was now healthy enough to go home to find his family. What do you do after the war? You go home, right? Soldiers go home. He went home. Went to his house that was still intact to find his family, knocked on the door. His neighbor, who he knew before the war, answered the door. Hi. Zev says, I'm home. The neighbor said to him, we know who you are. You have 2 hours to leave or we're going to kill you. This is the 1946. Why? Because they had taken his house. The Nazis banked on collaborators. It's part of the planning. When they went into Poland, how do you know where Jews are? In Germany, you identify them by asking churches to produce baptismal records, and thereby eliminating who is Christian and who's Jew, and find out that way. You can look at public records at city halls. When you go to Poland, how do you find out who's a Jew? Local people say, go across the river, take a right, they're over there. And what would happen in the first wave, they would kill all the males, believing that women, of course, couldn't resist. It's a male-dominated society, and about 3 weeks later, they come back and kill the women. Without the local help, they couldn't have done it. Simply not only telling people where they were, but also in the killers themselves were a lot of local people. I'm going to skip ahead here a little bit. I'm just about done. The camps themselves, when they're set up, you have to know that there were 10,000 slave labor camps, thousands of major concentration camps, 5 death camps, and it goes on and on and on. I mean, there were tens of thousands of camps staffed by all kinds of people. So a lot of people were involved in this enterprise. But to show you where the death camps were, specifically meaning gas chamber crematoria, they were in Poland for 2 very good reasons. One, the majority of Jews living in Europe lived in Eastern Europe, so they were close to where they needed to do the action, but also was centrally located. If you looked at the time when the camps were being built, at the height of German success, they'd taken out France, so you have the Atlantic Wall. They were almost in Moscow, which is probably right about here. Geographically, Poland is your safest place to conduct the operation for the longest period of time. Far enough away from the German people so they don't really know about it until the soldiers keep riding home, but also the place you get away with it for the longest. Now, I'm bothered by things like this as you sort of, and I at this point realize I've not made it very personal, and it's hard for me to do that. So we're looking at the process, how it all evolved. The very famous quote, right? Never again, to me doesn't work. We always cry, never again, right? That'll never happen, and of course it keeps happening. Why? Because never again simply means never again will Germans and their collaborators kill Jews in Europe in the 1940s. It's very easy to say how morally awful it was, and to go home at night. There are no simple answers. If anybody ever says, I've got the answer to the Holocaust, Daniel Goldhagen. Germans are born as anti-Semites, ready to kill every Jew when they get their hands on them. Simplistic way to earn a lot of money. But there are no simple answers. Was it anti-Semitism? Yes and no. Anti-Semites rescued Jews during the war. Was it Hitler as a totalitarian leader? No, he reacted every popular protest against his reign. He didn't do it unless the people said it was okay. A terrific example in 1942 when half German marriages that were German-Jewish marriages, when the husbands were arrested because they were Jews and were being sent to the camps in the East, their wives came out in Berlin and protested that their Jewish husbands in 1942 are being sent east. They released all of their husbands. It's the only known protest against the Holocaust during the war. So there are no simple answers here. Just because it happened doesn't mean it was inevitable. Remember, it's a twisted road to Auschwitz, says Karl Schleines. There were decisions that were made ad hoc that led to other opportunities. Hitler became successful, got more encouraged, and came up with new solutions, most of which were generated from lower people who said, hey, Hitler, I know you want to kill Jews, here's an idea. But the exact opposite could have happened. Had Hitler been stopped, which he could have very easily been stopped, had the German army stood up to him, had the professors stood up to him, had the Catholic Church stood up to him. Hitler was terrified of the Catholic Church. They were the political center of the German political spectrum. He was terrified that they wouldn't back him because they had already stated they were against racist ideas, racist laws. So he was worried about that. What would have happened? There were many good Germans. And there were people like Marion Pritchard who rescued kids. I've mentioned her today. This is a young girl she rescued during the war, who, when the war ended, she was 2, the baby was 2 when the war ended, saw Marion as a real mother. Had tremendous problems the rest of her life. Marion became a psychiatrist to help out people in need. This little girl visited Marion, I think it was almost 3 months ago, she told me, still, all these years later, because she has this close bond with Marion. Warren Priest, a friend of mine who lives in New Hampshire, was a liberator of Buchenwald, who now is a tremendous peace activist, saying we must recognize the early warning signs of human rights violations. And I just leave you with these images of the people who were the pariah in Nazi Germany, the people who were enemies of the state because the state was threatened. And I leave you with a thought of, was it inevitable? No. Were Germans all anti-Semitic haters? No. What allowed these people to be enemies of the state? And I would suggest it would be things like fear, ignorance, jealousy, us versus them, careerism, anti-Semitism, and need for law and order rather than justice. And I leave you with that thought. Thank you for your time.